Let's talk about reference and configuration data. Inside of a database, we typically have different types of data, and we may classify data in different ways based on its use or its structure. For the most part, we think of all the data in our database as being transactional, related to our application in some way. This is data that we generate in production, and our users or our workload or some system produces it, and it's different than the data that we might have in development and test environments. For example, we may have sales orders, we may have customer names and information. This type of data is generated in production. We may have logging data that logs actions or changes. All of this is produced in a production environment, and it's different than what we might test with or what we might build in development. However, we also have other types of data that we typically would call reference data, lookup data, static data, that actually is the same in all environments. So we have the same data in development, testing, production, and all intermediate environments. And as a matter of fact, we often have this data managed by the development group and deployed along with the application. We have to have any changes migrated so that the software works correctly. Examples of this type of data are typically things like lists of countries, we might have organizational charts, we might have specific status codes or lookup values that we actually have to display in our application. They give users a choice, and they're well-known information that doesn't change from environment to environment. Our users typically can't update this data, or if they can, they're using a known set of data that we have to ensure exists in all environments. For example, postal codes. They have to ensure that those match everywhere. We manage this data. We'll talk about later about how we actually manage, store, and deploy this database code, but it's one type of data that we have to deal with. Another type of data that presents a challenge in the database world is configuration data, or environment-specific data. Examples of this might be messaging queues, email server addresses. It might even be the specific database server that our application connects to when we're working in a scale-out environment. Now, this data is like reference data, but controlling this data is handled differently because often it's a group like operations that has to manage this data. They're providing the infrastructure, and so they know where the values are. These values are also differently from one environment to the next. For example, we won't want to send emails or send messages to a queue in development that are meant for production or vice versa. We want to ensure these are appropriate. Encryption keys are another great example of where this data has to be managed separately and configured differently as we move from environment to environment. Handling this code is complex and it's difficult. Right? It depends on what data it is. It depends on how often it changes. Is this sensitive data or not? And so using the same deployment tools might not be appropriate for the environments, or it might be. Now, one way we can do this is we can use variables that are set in each environment, and so our process will ensure that the appropriate variable is set to the appropriate environment. This works fine, but we have to be careful because we have to ensure that there's no typos in there, and in essence, we're not actually testing those variables until we get to that environment. We have to ensure there's security involved. So if I have encryption keys, I have to make sure that they're appropriately secured in each environment. Developers might be able to look at an encryption key in development, but we don't want them to see the production keys. And we have to be sure that we overload that data when we move from one environment to the next. I typically recommend we have a separate deployment pipeline for sensitive data or data that we want to ensure is very carefully managed. A lot of this is because that data changes at a different cadence than the rest of our software. We may deploy changes to our application or our database every day or week, but we'll change encryption keys once a year. It's very rare. The other thing we have to consider is that often we're using DevOps tools like PowerShell DSC or Chef or Puppet or something else that allows us to control the configuration and settings in a particular environment and deploy things consistently. These are great tools to manage our environments and ensure that our deployments are always performed the same way. But we have to ensure that the specific changes for each environment are actually stored and then they're deployed appropriately to that particular environment. We also have to be aware that when we're making these changes, we're never really testing that change until it's deployed to that environment. That's a challenge. We have ways to deal with it. We'll talk about those in another module.